Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'll let everyone take a couple minutes to connect to audio and video if you want. I see a lot of you on, so thank you. So as you're connecting, if you've been on these calls before, we like to use that meeting chat function. So if you want to go ahead and open that up, and I've got two questions for everyone. I would love to know where you're calling in from today. And then I would love, or we would both love to know, what is the most unconventional country you've been to date? So if you can just go ahead and drop that in the chat box, this will just be a great way for all of us to get to know each other a little bit better on the call and for our speaker as well. So my name is Laura. I am one of the San Diego chapter leaders and one of the TNN virtual event hosts, which is why I'm here with you today. I'm a travel advisor and I run a family travel blog called Travel 80 by 80. So super excited to be here and hosting Dan actually for this conversation. This one is, I'm super passionate about this. So before we get started, I am going to just share with you about the Nomadic Network for those of you who aren't familiar with it, but I have a feeling obviously most of you all know what we do. But the Nomadic Network, otherwise known as TNN, was founded by Nomadic Matt in 2019. So far to date, we've hosted over 250 virtual events. We've been back to hosting in-person events for over a year now. Hopefully you have been to some of them, and we have a brand new website, which obviously you have seen since you registered for this event. These are some of the photos from all of the in-person events that we've had worldwide. So always check our calendar to see if there's one near you that you can join us at. A couple ways to follow us are through Instagram or TikTok. Our handles are right there. You can register again for any other upcoming virtual events we have or in-person events. And then travel us with on group tours. We have a couple more spots open on the ones this year. Quite a few are sold out, but if you're still looking to go, definitely check that out on the calendar to see if it's something you would be interested in going to. It's just a great way to get to meet more people in this travel world. So just a couple of reminders. I see a lot of you with your videos on. That's awesome. This is just makes it fun and more interactive. And then I will keep everyone muted just for the duration of this so I can make sure we hear our speaker for today. But use that chat box, can ask whatever you want in there. But when you ask a question, if you can just write the word question first, that way I can make sure I see it and I'll get it answered for you at the end of the call. And then do make sure you follow our speaker, especially Dan today. He's doing this out of the kindness of his heart by being here today, this morning, and sharing all of his wisdom and experience with us. So definitely give him support, and I'll link all of the ways you can connect with him too. And let's just have some fun and enjoy this time together. So now, without further ado, I get to introduce our lovely speaker for today. So Dan, he is a native of Boston, but he has truly spent the majority of his adult life abroad. He immigrating to 3 countries, and next year he's applying for his 4th citizenship. So during his decade living in South Africa, he co-founded a corporate educational travel company that took over 1,000 African entrepreneurs and business leaders to 10 of the most innovative countries. He's been to 80 countries to date and aims to visit 100 by the age of 40. It's just incredible. He writes for various publications about travel and global mobility and is very, very passionate about helping others globalize their lives. So Dan, welcome, and I will let you take it on over from here.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming to my talk. I'm just going to share my screen. Great. So thank you for coming to my talk on the value of traveling to unconventional countries. I'm going to show you a brief clip from one of my most memorable trips, and later on in the presentation, I'll tell you where this was. You might be surprised when I tell you where. I want to start with a quote from a friend of mine, Rowan Beard, who works at Young Pioneer Tours, which is a tour company that I love. And I'm going to be speaking a little bit about two companies that I have gone to some of these destinations with. Rowan says, the more disconnected a country is from the outside world, the more the locals appreciate the effort you've made to visit them. It makes them feel better as they are not forgotten, and they're as important to the world as any other country when it comes to tourism. So as mentioned, I have been to 81 countries to date. You may be surprised to see some of the colors in orange on the map when you find out a little bit more about my background and places that I've managed to visit. So my identity, I'm originally from the US. I'm gay. I am an Israeli citizen. I am a South African citizen, and I am soon to be a Canadian citizen. So my identity and my experiences are spread across multiple continents, which has actually made my travel even more complicated. These are my current 3 passports, and this is relevant when I explain how I visited some of the countries that I have. For starters, and many of you know this, it is illegal to be gay in many parts of the world. So the countries here in orange, you can go to prison for being gay. The countries in maroon, it's actually a death penalty. And some of these countries I have visited. Not all passports are created equally, but not for the reasons you may think. So a piece of advice, and I'm going to explain why, that I give to people is that if you are eligible for another passport, diversify your passport portfolio. You ideally want one strong passport that will get you into North America, the European Union, but it's also good to have one politically neutral passport because it will grant you access to parts of the world that otherwise would be off limits, which is what happened to me. So I'm going to start with the different passports that I have and what that means in terms of where I can and cannot visit. So as a US citizen, I cannot visit Syria, North Korea, and there are severe restrictions on travel to Cuba. In fact, using a US passport to enter North Korea is a felony and carries a prison sentence. As I mentioned, I'm also an Israeli citizen. All these countries in black are countries that Israeli citizens are barred from visiting. And some of them, if you even have a foreign passport with evidence of travel to Israel, you are barred from entering those countries. Countries where Israelis cannot visit include Algeria, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Yemen, Pakistan, and Malaysia. This is even a Malaysian passport. It says this passport is valid for all countries except Israel. However, my travel trajectory changed in 2018 when I naturalized as a South African citizen after living there for nearly a decade. So South Africa doesn't have the strongest passport. As you see, it really only grants you access to certain countries, not Western Europe, not North America. However, what do you notice that's a little bit different about this map? There are no countries in black. There are no restrictions. So as soon as I got my South African passport, the first question I asked myself was, where can I go now that I couldn't before? There was a pretty obvious answer, but it was a scary one.
Thanks, Ephraim. An American student held in a North Korean prison is back on American soil. Otto Warmbier was convicted in March 2016 for allegedly committing anti-state activity. His punishment? 15 years hard labor. But in a dramatic move, the regime released Warmbier on Tuesday. Tragically, his parents recently discovered that he'd been in a coma for almost a year. George Thomas has that story.
And it is meant for serious patients in serious situations like this one.
Otto Warmbier was rushed to a Cincinnati hospital shortly after arriving from Pyongyang late Tuesday night.
You can see him moved into the hospital.
His nightmare started in March 2016, when North Korea says they caught the 22-year-old trying to steal a propaganda poster from the hotel he was staying at while on a tour of the reclusive nation. A security camera allegedly caught Warmbier in the act. He was arrested and weeks later brought to North Korea's Supreme Court, where he pleaded for mercy.
Please, I have made the worst mistake of my life, but please, act to save me.
But the judge showed no mercy. In a trial that lasted just 1 hour, the native of Ohio was convicted and sentenced to 15 years hard labor.
Please save my life. Please think of my family.
Warmbier's parents.
So I suddenly could go to North Korea, and I saw a tour online and I decided to sign up for it. However, I had second thoughts after signing up for that trip, the more investigating I did. And I pulled out at one point, and then I decided to go ahead with the trip. But I really had dilemmas about whether I'd be endangering myself, because Americans were barred from visiting North Korea by the US government shortly after Otto Warmbier was arrested. Dylan Harris, who's the founder of Lupine Travel, another company that I love, when asked about traveling to North Korea and the ethics behind it, said, North Korea has been cut off and ostracized from the outside world for over 70 years now, and it has had no positive effect on the country. The tour guides are the children of the elite and potentially will be the decision makers of the future in North Korea. I decided to proceed and go on this trip, and then I was sent a contract. Part of the contract said that under no circumstances should you insult their leaders in public, damage, deface any images of their leaders, or any political slogans and imagery. I had to sign a contract not to bring a Bible into the country as part of the tour. I could not photograph military personnel, checkpoints, or even construction. Foreign tourists have to be accompanied by a guide at all times. We cannot leave our hotel unaccompanied. Even when I needed to go to the bathroom when we were at various places, I had to ask for permission. Our movement would be severely restricted. And on top of it, we had to sign a contract that we would not post any images or anything really from our trip on social media upon our return. So I signed this contract, took a big gulp, and paid my deposit. About a month or two later, I flew to Beijing and boarded an Air Koryo flight from Beijing to Pyongyang. It was about a 2-hour flight. Air Koryo is infamous for these mystery meat burgers and this, lime green soda. That's what I ate on the flight as we listened to propaganda music blaring for the entire 2 hours. And then we got to North Korea, and I met actual North Koreans who live in North Korea for the first time. These were my two guides. It was a very unusual experience. My guides spoke fluent English, but had never been outside of North Korea. They said that they had never even heard South Korean pop music. I would constantly ask them, have you heard of Dolly Parton? Have you heard of Celine Dion? We had absolutely no common cultural references. We wound up, however, bonding over our love of dogs. As mentioned, we were watched at all times on the trip. There are two guides who watch each other as well as the group. You have a government cameraman who's supposedly taking a video of the group and they make a clip at the end. And you have a bus driver. The cameraman and the bus driver are watching each other. Everyone's watching each other. There's constant surveillance. This is a scene from Pyongyang, and you'll notice, these very, very wide boulevards and hardly any cars. Very colorful buildings, very, very few people. Only the elite are allowed to live in Pyongyang. It almost felt in a way like I was on a movie set. It was the capital city. But it was still an incredible trip. Scary at times, but incredible. These are statues of the two great leaders. We had to bow to the statues and lay flowers at their feet. It's obligatory for foreign visitors. We went to the mausoleum where there's displayed in glass display cases, and we had to bow to them. It's essentially the holiest site in the country. This is even a pavilion where they named a new strain of flowers after the great leaders. It was truly eye-opening. I'd never been to a country quite like this. There's no social media or cell phones in North Korea. I had never been so cut off from the world during the 5 days that we were there. So they don't get their news on Twitter. This is how they get their news. So this is in one of the metro stations in Pyongyang. This is just taking an ordinary subway car in Pyongyang. Again, propaganda music playing, photos of the great leaders. This was quite a funny story. We went to a restaurant and our waiters doubled as performers. So they would bring us our meal, run into the kitchen, change, get on stage and perform, then run back, change back, take our plates away. And it would go back and forth like that throughout the whole evening. I discovered that North Korea is actually a very musical nation. There were only about 50 tourists in the country at the time. We went in the winter, and one evening, the only 2 tour groups in the country got together and had dinner. And I can confirm that I definitely was the only American-born tourist in North Korea at that time. One of the biggest lessons I've learned from unconventional travel is you need to perfect your poker face. You're going to hear narratives that challenge your own, and they're going to be very flawed at times. The key is to be calm, listen, and be curious. You don't have to agree with what they're saying, but you also need to respect that many of these people don't live in free societies, and they're not always able to speak about certain topics that you want to talk to them about because it'll endanger them and their families. So I always listen very carefully and try to read between the lines of what they're actually trying to say. This is one example of perfecting my poker face. This is the Victorious War Museum in North Korea. The museum is all about how the US started the Korean War. I saw images that were very challenging. These are confiscated US Army equipment, photos everywhere of running over dead US soldiers. This is the USS Pueblo, which in 1968 was captured by the North Koreans. Over 80 US soldiers were held hostage for a year. An American sailor was killed. You go inside, here are the bullet holes, the sham trials. I had to listen to this as an American for over 2 hours, and the narrative was patently false. But again, I was in North Korea, so for my safety and the safety of my group, it was important to be curious, ask questions, but first and foremost, maintain my poker face. These were bears that at a circus that they took us to who were boxing each other on their hind legs. My fellow participants and I were horrified. But as I mentioned, we had no freedom of movement while in North Korea. We couldn't just walk out freely in disgust. So we had to sit there with our poker faces, and it was disturbing. Dog soup. This is a delicacy in North Korea. I had to sit there. I have 2 dogs myself and watch people eat this. Again, not much I could do. This is the culture, but I kept a straight face. This was in Sierra Leone. They eat monkeys, also something that was quite horrific to an animal lover like me, but I had to maintain my poker face. As an American, I went into the former US Embassy in Tehran. Again, they spewed anti-American propaganda for about 2 hours. I certainly did not want to endanger myself. What was very interesting, though, I mean, this was in 2018, is that our guide in English in the former US Embassy said, "We love President Trump because President Trump is against our government and we are against our government. The enemy of my enemy is my friend." I was quite shocked to hear this at the biggest symbol of anti-Americanism in Iran. And this was inside the embassy, the equipment they confiscated, anti-American propaganda, not the easiest place to visit as an American. This is outside the embassy. And of course, as an Israeli, visiting the Hezbollah Museum in South Lebanon was very, very difficult. We had a member of Hezbollah take us around for 2 hours and talk to us about how they want to eliminate the state of Israel. They took us through the tunnels, model tunnels that they used to attack Israel, the command center to attack Israel. These were confiscated Israeli army equipment, and there was a symbolic spider web, artistic spider web over them to show how they've captured Israel. Not easy for me to look at, especially as a former Israeli soldier, to look at a monument to celebrating the death of Israeli soldiers at the hands of Hezbollah. This was in Tehran. These are the graves of the Iranian nuclear scientists who were assassinated by the Mossad in Dubai, which has now become a shrine that people pay pilgrimage to. This was in the airport in Shiraz, Iran, down with the USA, down with Israel, at the metal detector, just like you would see a TSA sign. And of course, you go to some of these countries and they have real personality cults. On the left, this is a subway station in Tehran. On the right is a school in Azerbaijan. It is very unusual, highly anti-democratic, but it is not safe or respectful to go to these countries and openly criticize their forms of government while you're within their borders. This is a really crazy story, given my identity. So we were at the tomb of Ayatollah Khomeini in Tehran on the 40th anniversary of his return from exile. And we were probably the only foreign tourists there. Very few people wanted to go to Iran at that time. And his official Instagram account came and said, we want to interview a foreign tourist about what you think of the Ayatollah and Iran. And everyone in my group was too afraid to be interviewed. So I stepped forward and said, sure, I'll say a few words. And again, I had to maintain a poker face. I had to say something very neutral. You don't want to put yourself in a compromising situation when you're within these countries' borders. So this is just a short clip being interviewed through the IRGC, excuse me, watching me, my tour group, locals, while they ask me very controversial questions about what I think about the Ayatollah. You can also see how the female participants in my group had to cover up while we were
the fact that it's open 24 hours a day is very unique.
This was at a Lebanese army base, which was very, very interesting. I was talking to soldiers. Again, I was in the Israeli army. Here I am in the enemy country talking to soldiers from the other side. And it was pretty tragic. They told me that the Lebanese currency has been devalued so much that what they earn in the army doesn't even feed them. They don't even have enough money for food. And all they talked about was wanting to leave Lebanon. It was quite unusual to meet with soldiers who were there to defend a country, talking about how all they wanted to do was leave the country. This was in a Lebanese army helicopter on the border with Syria. They're so cash-strapped in Lebanon that if you pay the army $50, they'll take you on a 15-minute helicopter ride. But some difficult questions have arisen from these trips, and I'm sure you've thought of them. Is it ethical to travel to a country that persecutes its people? Is this war voyeurism? This was an ethical dilemma I had last year. I was in Liberia, and we were introduced to a man named General Butt Naked. During the Liberian Civil War, he was a warlord. He fought totally naked with his troops. They were child soldiers, and he was a cannibal. He was responsible for the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of children. He had a game with his soldiers that he would play where they would spot a pregnant woman and guess, is she carrying a boy or a girl, and then slit her stomach open to check. We didn't know this at the time. We knew he was a warlord who was rehabilitated. He became a born-again Christian. He was a pastor running an NGO now. But we met him, we all shook his hand, and then shortly afterwards, we went on our phones and realized who we had just met. And it certainly raised a lot of ethical questions for the participants. And we weren't entirely comfortable at all, and spoke about it throughout the trip. But when you're on these type of trips, you are going to be in situations where you meet people who do things or are in roles that very much go against your values. I did ask Dylan Harris again the question around, is it ethical? Is this war voyeurism? And he said, it is both fascinating and educating to hear real life stories from people who have lived through years of civil war and how they have been able to cope with it. And that's really why I do this type of travel, is that travel can humanize people from countries that the media demonizes. People that live in countries that are not free cannot get in front of a Western camera and say what they think. You usually only hear one perspective. It's usually about how horrible the government is. But the only way to really understand how people are coping with these situations is to go there yourself and hear privately from them what's actually happening. What is life actually like in this country? This is an example. I was in Khartoum, Sudan with a friend a year ago. When we think of Sudan, we think of it as being a state sponsor of terrorism. It housed Osama bin Laden. But we actually walked on the beach on our last day and just interviewed young Sudanese people, like what's life actually like in Sudan? You're not going to see this on CNN. What you're going to hear in the background is police shooting protesters. I'm just going to make sure the closed captioning is on.
Did you hear that?
Yeah. What's that?
Did you hear that?
No, it's not like,
I mean, like, protests are happening right now to get our rights, our civil rights. And I think the government is just like shooting us and killing our brothers and sisters and like sexually harassing us like everywhere. So yeah, I really hope they sit down and talk and like find like solutions for our problems, and that's it. Because our country is so beautiful and it deserves another chance.
It is. The land of it. We have a beautiful country, by the way, and our country needs another chance. Okay, if you want to know the Sudan well, you have to come here to visit Sudan, to meet a lot of people in the Sudan, to see what Sudan exactly.
What you'll discover going to these countries is that these people are just like me and you. They want better lives. They want freedom. They want democracy. Their governments do not represent them. Their governments actually oppress them in many situations. And I've met all types of people who are demonized in the media, and then I go and meet them in real life, and I see that they're actually kind of just like me. This is at a madrasa, an Islamic religious school in Iran. These people would be portrayed as Islamic fundamentalists, but I met them and we spoke English, and they were interested in where we were from and what we thought of Iran. And as I mentioned, another big conclusion is that countries with repressive governments are usually despised by their people. Their people do not like them, and their people love meeting others who come and who give the country the benefit of the doubt, and who just want to meet them and form a relationship and hear what their lives are actually like. When I think of Iran, I don't think of their evil regime. I think of like the wonderful students that would come up to us throughout the trip, asking us where we were from, wanting to practice their English. I think of the house parties I went to in North Tehran. These were totally Western secular people who were not free to live normal lives under the Islamic regime. Spoiler alert. So the clip that I showed you in the beginning was from Iran. This was from Shiraz. This was our group at a house party with local Iranians. It was wonderful. This is what I think of when I think of Iran. And by the way, they don't hate the US. They don't hate Israel. They want to be free. This was an amazing story in Saudi Arabia, which is a country that has not been open for tourism for very long. I was on the left here. I was at a place called Chop Chop Square. It's a place where up until MBS came to power, they would execute people in public. So I was at this square, seeing where they used to execute people. And this young Saudi man came up to me, he just walked up to me with 2 cappuccinos, handed me one and said, "Hey, do you want a coffee?" We started talking. It turns out he studied in the US. He really wanted to meet an American, wanted to speak English. And he said, "Let me take you to a local concert tomorrow." There are so few Western tourists that come to Saudi Arabia. And here we are the following night at a local Saudi concert. Very few places in the world would you have locals so excited to meet someone from the outside world. Something that I also do when I travel is I try to connect with the LGBTQ+ communities, as well as the Jewish communities in the difficult countries that I visit. So this is in St. Petersburg, Russia.
Итак, всем все понятно. Третье место.
Бокал,
бутылочка шампанского от Параголовой устрицы.
Симферополь.
When we think about LGBT people in Russia, we generally think about how the government oppresses them, which is true. But I partied until 5 a.m. with gay Russians in St. Petersburg. It was incredible. I got to learn about what it's actually like to be gay in Russia today. And I formed relationships with people that I still stay in touch with. This is in Beirut, Lebanon at a gay club. It is illegal to be gay in Lebanon. The story is often more complicated than what it says in the law, as you can see. When I was in Iran, I wanted to connect with the local Jewish community. There are about 9,000 Jews still in Iran. And in order to meet the local Jewish community, I found out while I was there, you have to apply for permission from within the country. And I did this. And I was very afraid, oh gosh, have I now put myself out there? Now they're going to do all of these background checks. I'm really going to stand out. But miraculously, I was granted permission to meet with the local Jewish community. So here I am with a young leader outside of the headquarters of the Tehran Jewish Committee, which is their central umbrella organization. While I was there, I met a Jewish studies professor on my last day. And I said, you know, I would love to bring you to South Africa, where I live, on a speaking tour to talk about what it's actually like to be Jewish in Iran today. The Iranian Jewish community was super cut off. They weren't allowed to visit Israel. Because of the ban in place, they also weren't allowed to visit the United States. And I got the funding and brought 2 Iranian Jewish leaders to South Africa on a speaking tour to talk about what it's like to be Jewish in the Islamic Republic. This was in Beirut, the second time I was there. I had heard that there was a Jewish cemetery and I really wanted to see it and get in. It was closed to the public. So I showed up one day outside and the guy said, come back tomorrow. The caretaker might be here at 2 o'clock. I showed up the next day. The caretaker wasn't there. But then I met someone from the Christian cemetery next door. And I said, you know, my great aunt is buried in that cemetery. I'm the first person back in Lebanon in over a decade. I really, really want to just visit her grave. Can I get in somehow? And he took me to the Christian cemetery. I got a ladder, threw it over the wall, climbed down, and got into the cemetery. I was really interested to see, are Jews still living in Lebanon today? When are the freshest graves from? And I discovered that there was a grave as fresh as 2018. Here's 2013. There are Jews still living in Lebanon, even though they're very undercover. This was in Khartoum, Sudan. This is the Jewish cemetery. When the Jews were expelled from Sudan, the last ones left in the 70s, they basically turned this into a huge dump. All the graves were destroyed. Recently, the cemetery has been restored. And I arranged for my group, my tour group, to be the very first tour group to enter the newly restored Khartoum Jewish Cemetery, which is not open to the public. I feel an immense responsibility when going on these trips to come back and share my experiences. So these are just examples of the articles that I've written. I give talks, and I really try to focus on the day-to-day life of people living in these very difficult conditions, and how when we think about these countries, we shouldn't only focus on what we hear in the news, but we should actually try to humanize the people that live there. A few practical tips for people that are interested in traveling to very unusual destinations, the destinations that the government tells you to stay away from. The very first thing is about sharing your plans. You're not necessarily going to make it public that you're going to visit Iran, let's say, or North Korea when it reopens. But it's important that you share your plans with a few trusted people, that they know which embassy or consulate to contact if there's a problem, that they have your itinerary and the tour company's contact details. It's important to understand that most of these countries require visas, and it's a very unpredictable visa process. I had applied for a visa to Eritrea, and it took months to get that visa. And I only wound up getting it after lots and lots of begging on the day before my trip, and had to be personally interviewed by the ambassador. I have an American friend who was meant to go to Algeria recently. Algeria makes it extremely difficult for US citizens to visit. She didn't get her visa on time and couldn't go on the trip. So that's something one has to take into account. In a lot of these countries, there's very poor tourism infrastructure. You're not necessarily always going to have electricity. I was on a trip to Sudan where the entire group got food poisoning. They're not really fond of using hand soap in Sudan after they go to the bathroom, and they make all your food. It's important to remember that there are limited medical facilities. So, expect food poisoning, expect something to happen, and bring enough medication. Also, be prepared to be cut off from the world. You're not going to have internet access or phone access during a lot of the trip. That can make it difficult. or you can view it as a bit of a digital detox. And from friends that I've spoken to, it can be very challenging for solo female travelers to go to some of these countries. They've told me that you really need to be hyper aware. And many female travelers I know choose to go with a tour group to some of these countries because it's safer, or they choose to go with a male friend because when they're with a male companion, they're not harassed. But as soon as they're on their own, it becomes very difficult. Something also to keep in mind is travel insurance. Many travel insurance companies will not insure you if you're visiting a country that the government says is too dangerous to visit, stay away. Like I think it's level 4. So for some of these countries, I actually have to take out a special travel insurance from the UK because that's the only company that will insure us. And then something also to just keep in mind is solo versus group travel. I know there are many people that say, I really don't like going on group trips. I really like traveling on my own. But I think it's important to remember that some of these countries, your mobility is really limited. I mean, I think of places like Sudan, you need permits just to travel outside of Khartoum. English isn't spoken. It is so logistically complicated traveling within some of these countries, and there's so much bureaucracy that even if you can travel solo, it's just not worth it. And that's why I especially do group travel to unconventional countries. I'm going to do a quick shameless plug. I am going to be launching a business in a few months called Rootless Mobility. So if you have ever considered moving abroad to start a new chapter in your life, but you weren't sure where to start, my business is going to help you do that. People want to move abroad for all types of reasons, for a higher quality of life, more disposable income. They might want to obtain a second passport or have more political and economic stability. I've immigrated 3 times. I've helped countless people immigrate. And that's what my business is going to be doing. I am looking for a few first clients before I launch. So if you're interested in chatting with me, my email address is dgbrotman@gmail.com. And please stay in touch. Here's my Instagram handle. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm really looking forward to our Q&A now. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, Dan, fascinating. I felt like my mouth was open with so many of the pictures and stories you have. And I know I've seen a lot of that in the comments as well. Just incredible what you have experienced. And I don't know about everyone else, but I wanted more. I want you to keep going. There's just so much. It's amazing. You have to write a book or something someday for sure about it, because there's quite a lot of experiences you have gone through. I'm so curious. We have a lot of questions, but I'm just curious, what was the first, I guess, most unconventional country for you that you went to? Like what kicked it off?
Well, that would have been North Korea. And that
was the first one. Okay.
That was the first one. I was pretty well traveled before that, but I never went to countries that scared me. And that was the first time I did it. And that was back in 2018.
Okay. Wow. You've done a lot then. Oh my goodness. Since then. Okay. Incredible. Well, and North Korea, that's a huge one to start with. Okay. So one of the first questions we actually have is about that's from Olivia. And she was just saying, what an incredible experience to visit North Korea, but how did you feel about contributing to the economy of the regime there? And did that play into your decision-making at all about visiting that location?
Absolutely. I had many, many moral dilemmas about visiting North Korea. I certainly did not want to legitimize that regime. I did not want my money to go to the government. On the other hand, I didn't have a choice because you have to go through the government-owned tour company. I basically decided that the pros outweighed the cons. I agree with what Dylan Harris from Lupine Travel said, that the people that we would be meeting in North Korea are really the elite of North Korea. They're the future leaders of the country. And it's very, very important to foster people-to-people contact. And just like it's important for us to humanize them, it's important for us to be humanized by them too. I think there's a lot of value for them to meet people from the Western world who say, we don't hate you, we want to understand you, and we want friendship. And I'm hoping that the more exposure they get like that, the more their decision-making in that country will change in the future as their leaders change.
Incredible. So another question, I think when you were talking about North Korea, is Joelle was curious how you actually got those pictures, because I know a lot of it, obviously there's so many rules, but how did you manage to pull that off?
So we were allowed to take pictures in North Korea. It was no problem. We were not allowed to take pictures of construction sites or soldiers or certain monuments and mausoleums. But yeah, we were free to take pictures of everything. I do think with the bears, I wasn't allowed to take a photo, but I just snuck one with my phone. What I do remember, though, is when we landed in North Korea, I had a Kindle, and I had all types of books on my Kindle, and I actually had to clean my Kindle out because I had some books about North Korea in it. And what was interesting is when we landed, there was a travel companion of mine who had a book about baseball, like a hardcover book. They confiscated his baseball book. They didn't know what to do with my Kindle, so there was no issue. And I think it was kind of similar with cell phones. As long as you respected the rules, they didn't really know what to do with that kind of technology. So I followed all the rules. I signed a contract, and I didn't have a problem.
Interesting. And then they never went through to look at the photos you took or anything? No. Okay.
No. But if we had broken the rules during the trip, the consequences would have been very severe. I mean, the rules are so strict in North Korea that, first of all, if you take a photo of a statue, let's say of the great leader, you have to take a photo from their feet all the way until the top of their head. You can't take it a part of their bodies. That's one of the rules. You're not even allowed to fold a photo that has of the great leader. So we were told of a previous group, there was an Argentinian tourist who had bought a North Korean newspaper. It had, of course, a picture of the great leader. And I think he just folded it in half and left it on his hotel room desk. He got in very, very serious trouble and had to write sort of like a groveling apology letter. So we were very aware of the rules. I think our tour company did a good job at really letting us know this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. But as long as you stick to the rules, I found that there wasn't really a problem.
Okay, good to know. So if you're not a rule follower, do not be going there. Yeah, don't risk it. Okay, we actually had a lot of questions about traveling and being Jewish. Did they know that you were Jewish when you were there? When did you disclose that you were Jewish, American, or gay? Just how did that happen in some of the initial process of getting into those locations?
So, generally I try to build rapport with someone first before I tell them all about who I am. I mean, generally when I go to these countries, I tell them, I work for the economic development department in my city. I kind of just have a general alias. I remember I was very scared in North Korea because even though I went as a South African, my place of birth on my passport says USA. They have if they want to hold someone hostage for a negotiation, they have no options anymore because Americans aren't allowed to go there. So I was pretty terrified. And I remember we had a bus drive one day and we were playing this game where each person in our group would come to the front of the bus and sing their national anthem. And then it was my turn to come up and sing a national anthem. And I was going to go up and sing Nkosi Siphilele Africa, the South African national anthem. And some of the participants started shouting, "Oh, Dan, sing the Star Spangled Banner." So, I really I felt very, very uncomfortable when that happened. And I think that ultimately, when I build one-on-one trust with someone in a country, then I can tell them a bit more about my background. But it goes the same. The reverse is true too. People aren't just going to walk up to you and say, "I hate the Islamic regime in Iran." You have to build rapport with people. They'll eventually start to tell you their views. You'll start to tell them a bit more about yourself. Something I also have to be very careful about traveling in these countries is not endangering the people that I meet. I don't want to have a situation where people are accused of, socializing with an American spy or an Israeli spy. So I also need to be very careful. There are some countries where I'm not going to tell them the whole story, and it's really for their safety more than mine. But ultimately, when true human relationships are built just like at home, then people start to talk a little bit more.
It's such a good point about that. I'm curious, have you ever run into people in your discussions with building that rapport that some of them just did not want to talk to you, and then you just kind of move on? Or I was curious, or if most are pretty open to just chatting with you?
Most are very open to chatting with me. To be honest with you, I have never experienced anti-Americanism in any of these countries. I actually find that when you say you're from the US, they're actually very excited, very curious. And as I said, they like the US. The US is often against their governments. They're against their governments too. I've even found, discussing Israel and countries like Lebanon, Iran, you talk to people there, they just want peace. They want prosperity. The people in these countries really don't hate the US and Israel. You have, the government you might have certain political parties that do, but ordinary people don't. So I have asked people in these countries, what do you think of gay people? What do you think of Israel? And I was very surprised by some of the answers. And also, let's not forget that the internet has really changed and expanded the view that young people have of the world. Young people all over the world are much more socially liberal now, thanks to the internet. And they know what's happening in other countries, maybe not in North Korea so much, but they know.
Yeah, very true. Okay, so Matt had a question about, and this was kind of in line to what we were talking about before, but since, obviously you're connected to the US, have you ever been questioned about that connection, since most of the passports probably show your place of birth on them? And then if so, how do you go about navigating that?
So interesting. I was actually meant to go, I mentioned that I was in Lebanon last year for a second time. I was actually going to go on a tour to Syria, an organized tour. And Syria does not let Americans in, but they go even further. Even if you have a foreign passport and your place of birth says USA, they do not let you in. So my visa was rejected along with a few other Americans with foreign passports on that trip. I already had a ticket to Lebanon. So because we were going to go from Lebanon to Syria. So I just hung out in Lebanon for a week. I have had instances, for example, after my trip to Sudan, when coming back into the US, I was taken in for questioning. That was probably the only time that that's happened. But again, I have absolutely nothing to hide. I went for legit tourism, so I just tell the truth.
Perfect. It's what you have to do, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So another question, I think you sort of already answered this, but they were curious if most of the tour or most of the country visits, were they done as a group tour for safety reasons? It sounds like you have, but have you done any non-group tours?
Absolutely. So Lebanon, for example, one I did as a group tour, one I did independently. Another one that I did independently was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, which has a really not a great reputation. They don't have tons of tourist infrastructure. There weren't a lot of guidebooks, but I did that on my own. Again, if it's a place that I'm very, very scared of going to, either because of my identity or just because I've been trained to be very scared of it, I will often do a group tour, especially if it's a place where there's a lot of bureaucracy to travel within the country. But yeah, absolutely. I go to countries on my own if it's logistically easy. And Saudi Arabia and Lebanon are two of the most recent examples.
Okay, perfect. You have done it all. My goodness. Okay, again, you sort of touched on this already, but I'm going to ask this one anyway. So when traveling to Iran or Saudi Arabia, when you were asked if you were Jewish at any point, wait, hold on, let me try to read this. Where you were asked if you were Jewish at any point, and if not, had you been asked, would you have said that you were? Does that make sense? It sounds like you're honest no matter what is the situation. So it sounds like you would have done that regardless.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I'm not going to name the country because I'm still going there, but I had to fill out a visa application recently that asked for my religion, and I marked Christian. So yeah, sometimes there's not a reason to always tell the truth. But no one's, I mean, to be honest with you, generally when I've told people that I'm Jewish, it's been great. I remember I was in Alexandria, Egypt last year, and there are hardly any Jews left in Egypt. I think there's 2 or 3 left in the country. We showed up at the synagogue, the newly restored synagogue in Alexandria. It's totally closed to the public. No one can go in. And I said, I'm a Jewish tourist. I want to visit. can I come in? And they made us go print out a bunch of documents, but we were allowed in when no one else is allowed in. When I think about what happened in Lebanon, I was actually a little nervous. Like, I'm actually going and saying, it wasn't true. My great aunt is buried in this cemetery. Clearly, and they asked, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, yes. I was a little nervous, but it was a risk worth taking. So yeah, I sort of, generally I tell the truth and it's not an issue, but yeah, on a visa application to some of these countries, I'm not going to write Jewish.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Okay. And you just actually talked about the Jewish cemetery. So we had a question about that. Do you know who was behind the initiative to restore the cemetery? I'm not sure if you.
Yes, I do. I know the person personally. I don't know if they want me mentioning their name, but if you Google BBC, the BBC did a great story on it. So just Google Jewish cemetery Khartoum, and you will see for yourself. I was also asked not to post any photos on social media from that. What was really interesting, though, is we spoke to a caretaker of that cemetery, and I asked, are there any Jews left in Sudan? I mean, if you look officially at the statistics, it says, no, there are no Jews left in Sudan. And he actually said there are 2 or 3 left in the country. 2 of them live in a more remote region. I only visited that Jewish cemetery in Beirut on the very last day of my trip. I went out for dinner that evening and I met these 2 Danish guys who run a think tank in Beirut. And I told them that I had been to the Jewish cemetery and I asked, are there any Jews left in Lebanon? I found these graves from just a few years ago. And they said, yeah, actually down the street, there's a chocolate shop that's run by a Jewish family. And I feel like if I had stayed in Lebanon for a few more days, I would have gone down that rabbit hole and tried to find at least one.
Wow. And wow, just incredible. I don't know. It's so incredible. All of your stories. Okay. So flipping a little bit. So we had a question. Is there any country that you regret visiting just because the experiences there were too repellent, too awful?
No. Like, listen, I'll be honest. We all got really sick in Sudan. The pyramids kind of looked like rubble. There wasn't a whole lot to do. They were shooting protesters. It was pretty awful. And I don't think I would go back to Sudan, but the conversations I had with those young women on the beach about democracy, about the future that they want, that for me made the trip worth it. And once again, when I think of Sudan, I think of those young women on the beach. I don't think of the government or the unimpressive pyramids that I saw.
Good. It's about the people, right? And those connections you make and the authentic conversations you're having with them. Like you said, that you're actually learning from them what their country is about. Okay. Question about your business that you're starting. So is it for everyone or is there certain criteria that you have to meet in order to, have this discussion with you about moving to a different location?
It's for everyone. I mean, people have different motivations for leaving. I have friends from developed countries who I've assisted to immigrate, who left for certain reasons. I have friends from less stable countries who decided to immigrate for other reasons. So anyone who's interested in just talking to me, please get in touch. I'd be very happy to have a conversation.
Perfect. And I did drop in the chat box and I can do it again, but I put in all of your contact information and then your email as well, if you have more specific questions regarding that. Okay, we've got a few more questions. These are great questions, by the way, everyone. Dan, you are just so incredibly knowledgeable and I think have probably done way more than any of us. So it's just fascinating to hear all of this from you. Okay, so were you allowed into Islamic countries with an Israel visa stamped in your passport? And have you experienced any difficulties traveling after visiting Iran?
Actually, it's a similar answer for both, which is that, first of all, I have an Israeli passport, so there's no reason why I would have any type of Israeli stamp or visa in another passport, but Israel doesn't stamp passports anymore. Many countries are actually moving in that direction. So if you typically, if you don't need, if you're from a Western country, you don't need a visa to visit Israel. So there really should be no sign of having visited Israel in your passport. But actually, Iran wound up doing a similar thing. They stopped stamping because the US in particular was making it so difficult for people who visited Iran Another practical consideration I just forgot to mention is that if you're from a visa waiver country, so those are many of countries like in the European Union, you don't need a visa to enter the US. If you visit certain countries, you are no longer eligible to enter the United States visa-free, and you have to go do an interview at the US Embassy or consulate just like anyone else. So I remember, when I go on these trips with people to places like Sudan or Iraq, all the Europeans and Australians on my trip say, we've now lost our visa-free status to visit the US. We're going to have to apply for a visa like everyone else. So no, I have not had a problem either way because those two countries, Israel and Iran, do not stamp passports anymore. But the European and Australian tourists who went on my Iran trip had further complications if they wanted to, would have further complications visiting the US if they wanted to.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's great, because that was another question that we had, is that, or a kind of a comment, that in the US you can sometimes go under questioning if they see you had been to Iran, but if they're not stamping it anymore, then...
Well, it's complicated. So I went on a South African passport. South Africans actually get visa on arrival. So I had no stamp. Americans, Canadians, Brits, for example, if they want to visit Iran, they have to be with a tour group. It's like North Korea, and they are not allowed to leave their tour group. So I was allowed to go off to house parties in North Tehran and wander the streets by myself and stay after the trip because I was there as a South African. The Americans and the Brits on my trip were not allowed to do that. And they actually had to apply for a visa in advance and had a very prominent Iranian visa in their passport. So yeah, I would assume that they would be questioned upon returning to their home country, especially to the US.
Gotcha. Okay. So maybe you have two things with your advising business, one with the relocation and one with helping all of us figure out how to get to these countries, because you have all the information. My goodness. Okay. So another question, I'm traveling to these unconventional countries, if you were to be in danger or trouble, what are the options or aid that maybe you would have if you're a solo traveler versus a group versus in a group tour? And what in the world would you do if you got in trouble?
Sure. So something that I always look into first, and I mean, this is a privilege that I have because I have multiple passports, is where will I get who will give me consular protection if God forbid something happens to me in these countries? So for example, there are some countries where South Africa has diplomatic relations, but the US and Israel don't. An example of that would be North Korea. So if something had happened to me in North Korea, I mean, I would have had very, very limited consular protection, whereas South Africa is represented by their embassy in Beijing and North Korea. So they at least would have had channels to speak to the government. I always look into that. So I think that that's one thing, is having all of the contact information for your embassy or consulate, knowing that you'll be protected. I created a WhatsApp group with a few close friends and just updated them every day about what I was doing, so that if they didn't hear from me or something happened, they would know that something's up. But again, if it's a country where you're really nervous, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it. Just go with a tour. When you go with a tour, they're not going to put you in danger. They're going to make sure that it's very smooth. And that really allows me to sleep at night when I'm, coming up to going on these trips. I feel quite comfortable going with trusted tour companies.
Perfect. All right. Just two more questions. One, this isn't a question. This was a comment. And I thought the same thing. So the women on the beach, when they were speaking English, their English was so clear. I was just curious, how did they learn that? I'm not assuming that was something that was taught in school, but maybe. So what's the history behind that?
Goes back to what I was saying about the power of the internet. I mean, young people today are on the same platforms. In many of these countries, they have severely restricted internet access. That's actually something that I should have put in practical tips, is people use VPNs. So when you use a VPN, it basically makes it look like you're logging in, you're on the internet in the US, even though you're really in a place like Iran. So young people in these countries have access to VPNs, maybe not in North Korea, but they're accessing everything that we're accessing. They're watching the same TV shows. They're listening to the same music. And generally speaking, I haven't had a huge language barrier when traveling to these countries with young people.
It's incredible, right? I mean, their English was so clear. It was amazing. Okay, so this was more of a question about what you learned or heard in North Korea. So was there any mention while you were there about the US bombing of civilian populations in the Korean War? It's a very specific question.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. That museum was basically all about American war crimes and how the US started the Korean War. A lot of it was about bombings. And again, I mean, I take everything with a grain of salt. So I was very aware that I was being exposed to one particular narrative. I wasn't there to argue with them. I know the American narrative. I can go to South Korea and also hear their narrative. I was there listening to the North Korean narrative, knowing that it wasn't giving me the full picture, but it was giving me their picture. So yeah, absolutely. So there was a second part to the question.
Nope, that was it.
That was it.
Yeah, that was it. You answered it perfectly. All right, 2 more questions. So when you travel, and you have multiple passports, do you travel with like 2 of them at a time, or do you only bring 1?
So it depends. When I went to North Korea, I only took my South African passport. I left everything else behind. I absolutely did not want to be in a situation where they were going through my bag and found a US passport. Obviously, when I go to many of these Muslim countries or countries that don't have relations with Israel, I do not bring my Israeli passport with me. I will, though, bring my American passport because I do, even if I'm not entering with my American passport, having access to US consular protection, God forbid something happens, is very, very important to me. Also, my airport is the Detroit airport. So even though I live in Canada, I still have to fly back into the US. So of course, I need my American passport to come back.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so what is your next destination? Maybe conventional and unconventional.
My next unconventional destination is next month, Pakistan and Afghanistan. My next conventional destination is Lisbon in July. So I don't only go to these countries. I just came back from Mexico City. I love all different types of travel. This is just a particular niche of travel that I love.
It's perfect. And you have to balance it out a little bit anyway, because I'm sure it's so much more intense. And obviously the planning to go to these unconventional countries is so different. All right. And I'm going to end with this last one. So much info. You've had so much for all of us to just absorb, and we really appreciate it. Peter was curious if you could just sum up your advice in just a couple small points, what you would recommend to all of us.
What I would recommend is to make a list of countries that you're afraid of visiting, and then start researching what would it actually entail logistically to go there. You might find that there is a tour company that's going and that it's actually logistically simple. You can talk to people that have been to that country and they'll probably tell you it's actually safe. And I would challenge yourself, push yourself beyond your comfort zone, and visit one place that makes you a little bit scared. It's going to completely open your mind, and it's going to expose you to people who you never in a million years would have met otherwise.
Perfect advice. That is perfect to end on. What an incredible presentation. I know I saw in the comments, someone was saying you should talk for 2 hours just because you have so much information. You could have, and I think we would have all been still so into the conversation. So I really, really appreciate you being here. And I'm sure I echo the sentiments of everyone else that it was just incredible to open our eyes up to what's possible out there. And I definitely am going to make a list right now of where I want to go and what place is going to scare me the most and put it on my list. So much appreciated. And thank you to all of you for such phenomenal questions. Again, I dropped all of Dan's info in the chat. So hopefully you can connect with him afterwards. Before we go, I am going to share my screen one more quick time. Just let you know about a couple things coming up. So those were 2 that we did this week. And then the next one is, whoops, I just switched that out. Sorry. Is how Americans can move to Europe is easier than you think. So that will be a great one. And again, that's something that Dan is passionate about and is starting his business on in terms of moving to other locations. So you can talk to him about that as well. We have book clubs. This is our next one on April 5th. always fun conversations to chat with the author of these books. And then we have upcoming meetups. So always head to our calendar to see what location is coming near you. And this is, again, a great way to just meet other travelers and people who love travel just as much as you in the location you're in. And as I mentioned, we have these group tours, so definitely check it out. There's a couple more spots left. We'd love to see you on some of those. And thank you all for being here. It's always so fun to start the day or end the day with all of you. And we hope to see you at a virtual or in-person event soon. So thank you all. And thank you again, Dan, for being here. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye, everyone.